In the 1920s, the automobile expanded American horizons. It transformed male and female mating rituals. The chaperone was history. It increased home development in the suburbs. Now people could afford to live outside of the city and drive into town Monday through Friday to work. The car stimulated the construction of roads all throughout the United States. The engineering that went into assembling cars for mass consumption similarly transformed the world. Ford applied the scientific management ideas of Frederick Taylor and increased the output of the Model T by use of the assembly line. Conveyor belts sped with uniformity auto parts, while stationary workers individually assembled them into cars. The precision and coordination of workers laboring collectively allowed Ford to increase output to 9,000 a day. That was about one car every 10 seconds. For the individual labor, the job was tedious and monotonous. Ford compensated them with the highest wages in the United States. The application of the assembly line increased the number of Americans who had access to all types of luxury goods. Ford's workers were able to afford the conveniences of the modern world, including cars. Henry Ford had intended to, quote, get the process down to the buying power of the average American. The assembly helped to these ends. In 1908, when Ford began production of his Model T, it cost the consumer about $1,000. By 1925, Ford sold his Model T for $290. 10 million cars were in operation in 1920. By 1929, 26 million cars jammed the streets. In 1925, Alfred P. Salone, the chairman of General Motors, the major competitor to Ford Company, offered consumers different car models every year and models that suited different income brackets. If consumers could still not afford to purchase one by a lump sum, GM offered its customers the option of purchasing automobiles on credit. The distances that cars failed to traverse, movies and radio covered. These new forms of media helped Americans to hear and view parts of the United States and of the world that had been previously closed to them. Like the automobile, film and radio united the country in novel ways. These novel means of communication also expanded the freedoms of Americans by the creation of new jobs and by the introduction of fresh forms of entertainment. More importantly, radio allowed companies like Ford and GM to entice the public with their constantly improving products. Advertising became big business. Its earnings at $1.3 million in 1915 jumped to $3.4 billion in 1926. Besides cars, all sorts of new modern conveniences for the home were advertised. Refrigerators, washing machines, the vacuums, to name a few. By 1926, with 60% of Americans having access to electricity, such appliances would be at the disposal of the majority. The mass production of goods, the expansion of credit, and advertisements led many Americans to believe they could pursue their passions without restraint in the 1920s. Nothing was out of their reach. Advertisers pushed merchandise on the radio, magazines, newspapers, and billboards. They praised every product imaginable. In the 1920s, ads contradicted the traditional Victorian ideals of thrift and saving. The commercial agencies used the latest psychological theories to lure people into spending and borrowing. The liberated new woman, the 19th century granted them the right to vote in 1919, were a main target. Cigarettes were sold as liberty torches. Before the 1920s, women who smoked like a woman who wore lipstick, American middle-class values defined as degenerate. Advertisers transformed cigarettes into symbols of female liberation. Ads also catered to the desire of men and women to remain fit and attractive. Lucky Strike cigarettes promise consumers that if you, quote, light a Lucky, you'll never miss sweets that make you fat, end quote. This consumer economy that included almost everything from the construction of new homes and refrigerators to rayon stockings, lighters, and wristwatches led to a 50% jump in overall output and 40% jump in gross national product. Wages increased by 30% in the 1920s. Add jazz music and the end of the Great War, this all made the decade a festive and decadent one. This mass production of goods geared for mass consumption by American citizens stressed a new breed of individualism. It was not the pioneer individualism that settled the West or the Darwinian individualism that preached survival of the fittest and contempt for the poor, or the progressive individualism that encouraged free thought and the communication of ideas as a means to social justice. It was an individualism that centered on this new consumer culture. The roots of this individualism were fears of democracy that the United States' participation in the Great War bred. This individualism assumed the worst of men and women. Because people were believed to be politically irrational, many leaders and intellectuals worked to redirect the attention of the masses to the freedom they possessed to spend money. In 1929, Walter Lippmann, a famous American writer and thinker, published a best-selling book titled Preface to Morals. Lippmann warned his readers that not only did the despotism of public opinion threaten them, but their desires for material objects and perfect human relations doomed them. By concentrating on the consumer hedonism, jazz music, and the violent, erratic, and spontaneous new dances that incorporated kicking, jumping, and tossing of partners, we forget this was a decade that praised sobriety. The problem of drinking shifted from being an individual problem to a social problem. The Lever Act of 1917 had outlawed the use of grain in the manufacture of alcoholic beverages. This act was meant to conserve grain for the feeding of American troops in Europe. In 1919, however, the 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, transportation, and the sale of alcoholic beverages permanently throughout the nation. Prohibition was aimed at the lower classes, the new immigrants, who appeared to resist most Americanization. Prohibition was aimed also at the high classes, where individuals openly rejected traditional middle-class values as enthusiastically as the lower classes. Prohibition made the production, distribution, and selling of alcohol dangerous business. Gangsters turned major cities into war zones as they competed for markets. The potential profits were so high that bloodshed and imprisonment did not dishearten bootleggers. The gangster Al Capone's illegal booze business earned about $60 million in revenue a year. While Al Capone belonged to the 1%, his story still inspired the ambitious. The advocates of sobriety failed to solve the problem of drinking in the United States. Some critics argued prohibition made drinking worse. Behind the innovations in production and consumption and the hedonistic celebrations in the nightclubs that included illegal drinking, the world appeared menacing to many Americans. In April 1921, a Texas Democratic representative warned that, quote, the endless tide of immigration will have filled our country with foreign and unsympathetic to U.S. government element. The governments of the Orient are being overturned and destroyed, and anarchy and Bolshevism are threatening the very foundation of them, end quote. Such advocates of immigration restriction believed the same anarchy and Bolshevism intended to poison the American ideals of freedom, progress, and democracy. So it appeared to some that one way to arrest radical ideas would be by luring people to work and to spend the money they earned on all types of goods that satisfied their irrational desires. The restriction of inferior foreign elements from immigrating to the United States was another solution to political radicalism. Bolshevism, referred to as school of Russian communism. It was a communism modified and adapted by Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin to the economic conditions of Russia. Lenin also headed the Bolshevik Party, which overturned the Russian government in 1917 and established Soviet Russia. The United States perceived the Bolsheviks as a threat because they advocated the nationalization of private property. In addition to preaching economic leveling, the Bolsheviks adamantly opposed European colonization. The Bolshevik Party had global ambitions that many American politicians feared compromised their international credibility. That they intended to spread their message of world revolution internationally made Bolshevism the number one competitor to a Wilsonian world order. Besides supporting colonial revolutions, they advocated violent and immediate social change by class warfare. The Bolsheviks opposed middle-class Victorian values of work, marriage, and family. The Bolsheviks also, after they had assumed power in Russia in 1917, pulled Russia out of the Great War and signed a separate peace with Imperial Germany. This increased the strength of the German military in the Western Front against the French, British, and American forces. There was much that Americans hated about the Bolsheviks. The threat of Bolshevism damaged confidence in a free market of ideas in the United States. It seemed to many that bad ideas made people behave badly and that inferior ethnic groups such as African Americans, Russian Jews, and Catholic Poles were always vulnerable to being seduced by anarchists and Bolsheviks. U.S. leaders turned to doctors who used the pseudoscience of eugenics to prove the intellectual inferiority of specific non-Anglo-Saxon groups. This made the manifestation of democratic government the responsibility of old stock Americans in the United States, who had the deepest roots in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant USA. This intense racism had begun during the Great War. Anybody who opposed the draft, U.S. leaders automatically labeled as anarchist, which they usually were not. These intellectual opponents of the Great War heightened the fears held by old immigrants of foreigners. These radicals appeared to patriotic Americans much more menacing than they actually were. Yet that no real threat existed, we know in retrospect, and we should not allow that fact to downplay the fear and the will to defend by these conservative forces. Many of these so-called dissenters were German and Irish immigrants, or the children of such who resented the British. Others were political critics who interpreted the war through the perspective of socialism as a clash between imperialist nations and not a war to end all wars. In most instances, like in the case of the General Secretary of the Socialist Party in Philadelphia, Charles Schnick, who circulated anti-conscription pamphlets, the issues were simply that if Americans did not want to fight, they should not have to fight. Schnick's distribution of anti-war propaganda to homes across America landed him in prison. The government accused him of violating the Espionage Act. Convicted, Schnick appealed to the Supreme Court in 1919. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction. Eugene V. Debs, one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, also opposed the war. He told a working class audience that since individuals like President Woodrow Wilson mandated that, quote, the working class shed the blood, furnish the corpses, then workers deserved a greater voice in declaring war, end quote. The government convicted Debs as well under the Espionage Act. It was not just the reaction of the state that threatened intellectual dissenters. The public was also more willing to commit acts of vigilantism. Randolph Bourne, a progressive writer, warned Americans as the state ascended from beneath government and nation in the shock of war. Quote, every individual citizen who in peacetime had no function to perform by which he could imagine himself an expression or living fragment of the state becomes an active amateur agent of the government in reporting spies and disloyalists, in raising government funds, or in propagating such measures as are considered necessary of officialdom. The bullying of U.S. citizens who refused to buy war bonds or who failed to produce conscription cards when demanded to do so was not uncommon. Similarly, newspapers reported violence against German Americans that spanned from murder, like the lynching by mobs, to psychological intimidation, like the burning of effigies of German Americans. Such violent behavior by citizens of the United States many times attracted little attention from the local authorities. Eugene V. Debs' accusation of President Wilson and his administration for dealing in the, quote, most polite and ladylike manner with the broadcloth, lynch fiends, mob leaders, and man-whippers who incarnate the prevailing system in all its satanic, sodden beastliness, reflected Debs' contempt for the complacency of authority figures toward mass violence against intellectuals who who refused to bend to the will of public opinion. The domestic drama perpetuated by the war did not end when the war did. In 1919, labor strikes disrupted many cities in the United States. The number of bombings also increased. In the summer of 1919, an Italian anarchist bombed the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. 2 months later, another anarchist attempted a second assassination of Palmer. Both of the plots failed. During a Seattle strike, a package was sent to the mayor with a bomb in 1920. In New York, postmen discovered 16 bombs addressed to famous and powerful citizens like John D. Rockefeller. That same year, a bomb exploded in Wall Street, killing and injuring some people and destroying the offices of Morgan and Company. These bombings and strikes increased the public hysteria. Many supported Palmer and his crusade to arrest and deport anarchists and Bolsheviks. This was the Red Scare. In December 1919, Palmer deported to Russia more than 200 political radicals. One of these radicals was Emma Goldman. Federal agents invaded homes and offices without warrants. In total, federal officers arrested about 1,700 men and women during the Red Scare. College students also called for the suspension of professors who they accused of advocating radical ideas, and many states demanded that teachers sign loyalty oaths. It was in this environment that Congress pushed to extend the laws that set limits on immigration. Many congressional leaders intended immigration restriction to solve the problem of political radicalism. At stake in this immigration restriction was the defense of American principles. The opponents of restriction contended that everything the United States represented depended on free immigration. The advocates of immigration restriction insisted that all these new immigrants were different and would dilute the political principles that had made the United States a great nation. One senatorial critic of the immigration restriction bill lamented in 1921, quote, "The world is still crazy. The war is not over. After preaching for thousands of years the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and then engaging in 5 years in slaughter, it is but natural that we should be in an abnormal state. While the killing of men's bodies has stopped, the poisoning of minds has just begun. This bill is a continuation of the war upon humanity." End quote. This critic appealed to Americans to use their reason, which according to him would reject the prejudice that the bill instigated against Southern and Eastern Europeans. The resistance against immigration restriction failed. By 1923, the Ku Klux Klan had gained 5 million recruits. Many of these new members were not Southerners. Many Americans turned to leaders that preached religious fundamentalism, defended family values, and Anglo-Protestant ideals. The National Origins Act of 1924 established permanent immigration quotas that restricted the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans entering the country. The foreign-born percentage of the U.S. population fell from about 13% in 1920 to 4.7% by 1970. Jazz music, organized crime, the new political freedoms granted to women, and the Pan-African American consciousness inspired by black nationalists like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois caused anxiety among U.S. citizens who feared that American cultural, political, and religious ways were at risk of extinction. At the root of this identity crisis was a demographic shift that had little to do with immigration or political radicalism. The 1920 consensus revealed that 54 of 106 million Americans lived in urban centers. Urban living caused behavioral and cultural changes that many times were less a consequence of politics than of the new demands of city life. In the city, people appeared to lack manners, although they did not necessarily lack them, but were adapting a new set of manners that reflected the fast pace of cosmopolitan life. They appeared irreligious. Here too, this was not totally true. Religious ways, the city environment transformed, but the transformation was not toward atheism at all. And the traditional lines that determined the place of men and women were blurred by the urban landscape also. Psychologists placed a new emphasis on interfamily democracy. They advocated that husband and wife should be friends and lovers. Kristen M. Frederick, who advocated scientific homemaking, wrote about women in the 1920s, quote, "She has the widest freedom to enter marriage and as a wife and mother, she is deemed a partner in the family enterprise. Marriage being based on romance in America, it is inevitable that women are highly regarded and that this high regard be extended to financial considerations." End quote. The expensiveness of city life, the congestion of city living, and the opportunities offered to urban women in terms of education and work also affected views of motherhood. In the city, having 10 to 12 children was unpractical. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, and 2 years later, a research center. An opponent of birth control criticized Sanger, quote, "When the subsurface agitation in favor of birth control begins to assume shape as a popular notion that 3 or 4 or 5 children are enough, it takes away from the most conscientious parents something of the freedom to which they are entitled." End quote. Sanger never denied women the right to have big families. She wanted to educate them on the hazards to women physically and to the family economically when so many children were propagated. Sanger responded to critics that birth control has allowed women, quote, "to give each of their children a good start in life. It has prevented crowding and has moreover permitted them to enjoy marital communion which would otherwise have been impossible." End quote. All her justifications reflected the new ideas of interfamily democracy and modern romance. Birth control would remain illegal until the 1960s. The end of the Great War began a modern era in the United States. This modern era was full of contradictions that were a result of transitions from rural life to city life, from an economy of saving and thrift to one of consumption and borrowing, from prudish Victorianism to sexual liberation, from families dominated by patriarchs to ones where men and women shared power democratically. In this period of transitions, the individual appeared irrational. The power of the state expanded and established laws restricting immigration, political radicalism, and alcohol. Yet, in many of the images that survived decay and destruction from the 1920s, Americans appeared to have not a care in the world.